Sounds good, and we can get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce Henry Santer today. Henry is an ASP graduate student visitor from the University of Maryland. He's working with our old friend John Potterjoy there. He's been here with us 2 months so far in a 3-month visit where he's working on implementing diagnostics like Pissarosiers and other things for finding information about observation error distributions in Ensemble data assimilation. However, today he's going to talk about something else we'll get to in a minute. He got his undergraduate degree in applied math from the University of Maryland and liked the place so much that he's hanging on for his PhD. And today he's going to talk about things related to extensions of rank histograms, ways of evaluating consistencies of samples in data assimilation, other things. So, Henry, take it away.
All right. Thanks a ton, Jeff. So again, my name is Henry Santer. I'm in my 3rd year at Maryland right now, and going to actually break the talk up into 2 different parts. So the first half is going to be talking about this previous project, looking at this method for picking apart ensemble uncertainty for contour features. And the second part of the talk is going to be talking about some of what I'm working on while I'm here for my ASP visit. Both of these are NSF-funded projects through my advisor, through John Potterjoy. A quick overview of the first part of the talk, at least. We're going to start by just discussing a little bit why we care about looking at contour data and using contour features specifically. Going to review a couple existing proposed techniques for picking apart ensemble uncertainty with a focus on contour features. I'm going to introduce this idea of a data depth and a way that we can apply it to looking at contours and come up with a way to rank contour data. Then going to do a couple experiments with this method with some synthetic ensembles just to get a handle on how it works and some of the strengths and shortcomings of it. And finally, we're going to look at a couple experiments or use the method to pick apart a couple experiments looking at some convective systems with Worth ARW. All right, so first off, just to warm up a little bit, I guess, contours are ubiquitous as sort of an idea or as something that we use as geoscientists in modeling and understanding the atmosphere. This is a quick GEFS forecast of 500 millibar heights for getting the exact contour level from a few days ago. And the one thing that I want to sort of highlight about the way that we generally think of and use contours, it's captured pretty well by the blurb that NOAA provides for interpreting these products. So main takeaway from this that I want to sort of highlight is that the main way that we think about uncertainty for contour features most of the time is this relatively qualitative sense of if our contours are in good agreement, that means that the forecast has a lot of confidence, or we have high confidence in a forecast. Whereas if our contours are chaotic, then we have relatively low confidence in the forecast. And so what we're pursuing with this project is looking at a way to, or looking for ways to more quantitatively describe uncertainty when we're particularly interested in contour features. A specific sort of sub-problem or sub-use for contours that we're going to be focusing on is this idea of using contours to describe important boundaries or transition zones in physical quantities. What I've done here is list just a few papers from recent years that use contours, not only in the sense of sort of rendering, on a map where a cold pool is, but actually are defining cold pools in whatever analysis they are carrying out in terms of the contours of some underlying feature, generally either a potential temperature anomaly from a mean state or some contours of buoyancy or some measure of buoyancy near the surface. And for problems like this, again, the thing that we're pursuing is having something more quantitative that we can say when the features that we're investigating are specifically defined or well described by contour features. Actually doing that, just to drive the point home a little bit, is rather difficult. This is a very simple ensemble of just a few different waves. You could think of this as being geopotential waves over the US or something, but it's just a synthetic ensemble. And what we've done here is just taken a look at two current standard sort of ways to look at ensemble information. One of these on the right is looking at the ensemble mean field with some contour of interest rendered or plotted, and that gives us a great sense of sort of the immediate location of a contour and of gradients in the surrounding region. But we lose out on all of this juicy sinusoidal information that we get from looking at a spaghetti plot. There's all this sort of finer scale structure that you lose when you look at an ensemble mean. The trade-off is that when we're looking at our spaghetti plot here, again, it's quite difficult to talk in any real concrete way about distribution of these contour features. And if we have multiple different features or an observation that sort of is given by a contour, it starts to get difficult to talk about sort of location and spread and comparing distributions of contours. So this is our target problem. I'm going to spend a couple minutes looking at ways that this problem has been approached previously. So these are not the methods that we are focusing on for this project, but this is just sort of a quick review of other things that people have tried for this before. Sort of subcategory of methods for this that I'm going to highlight is ways to depict contour uncertainty that specifically are leveraging in some way the definition of a contour as the level set of some underlying field. So this first method was proposed in 2008. The authors, first names are escaping me right now, are defining something called a contour probability, where essentially they are prescribing some sort of tolerance or some prescribed range. They are plotting the probability based on the ensemble that a randomly selected ensemble member is within the range of a particular contour value. So looking at this visualization that they've come up with here, the sort of lighter or grayer, what I'll call, I guess, cloudier regions here correspond to places where there is a very high probability that we are close to whatever contour value we're interested in. And as we get into the dark and black regions there, means that we are very unlikely to be close to whatever contour value we're interested in. The next one of these methods that we're looking at that we're going to briefly mention is this idea of a level crossing probability. What this method sort of aims to do is, again, look at the definition of a contour as level set, some underlying field. And they ask the question, if we take two independently drawn realizations of some random variable, so for our purposes, two, for example, samples of an ensemble at the same point from different ensemble members, what is the probability that one of those samples is going to be greater than the contour value and one of them is going to be less than the contour value? Intuitively, if this value is close to zero, the implication is that if you pick two ensemble members at some point, that they're both going to be on the same side of a contour, and so you're probably not very close to sort of contour that you're interested in, that particular contour level. As that probability gets higher, the implication is that it is more likely that we're going to randomly pick 2 points that are on, or two samples that are on either side of the contour level, which means that we're probably pretty close to whatever sort of true unknown contour we're interested in. Both of these methods are great and do a lot well in that they give some immediate sense of the location of a particular contour feature that you're interested in and a measure of the uncertainty surrounding it. What they do tend to lose out on a bit, again, is this idea of getting the shape of these contour features and sort of the variability beyond what sort of gets smoothed out by these sort of pointwise statistics surrounding the contours. Right. before we go into the method that we're going to be using to approach this problem, we're going to do a brief introduction to this idea of a data depth. So data depth is essentially a way to generate, or maybe generalize is a better word, order statistics for all sorts of different types of data. First, what I've done here is not a data depth. This is sort of our standard way of thinking about how we order things for a univariate case. So we have more negative values on the left and more positive values on the right. We generally think about the smallest things as the things being most negative in terms of a ranking, and the largest things as being the ones that are most positive, which makes a lot of sense. What a data depth does is, instead of this least to greatest ordering, we're going to do a center outward ordering. Meaning, specifically, so we're going to look at whatever. Sorry, let me reset that sentence. The way that this data depth works is that we define the highest or greatest ranked values as those that are closest to the center of whatever data set we're looking at. And closest to the center can mean a lot of different things, and that's part of the flexibility of the method, is you can define this in a couple different ways. But the idea is that instead of having the largest value in the data set correspond to the quote unquote maximum, something that is more analogous to a median is going to represent the thing that gets the highest ranking. And then your outliers are going to, regardless of which way they are extreme, going to receive lower rankings. Right. Now I'm going to have a couple brief math slides introducing this idea of contour band depth, so specifically applying this data depth idea for contour features. To do that, first thing we're going to do is define something called a contour band. We say that we have a particular contour of interest C, that it falls within the contour band of two other contours if it is bounded by their union and their intersection. Now, when I talk about a contour being bounded, it's sort of using some language that's more suggestive of sets than of curves. And so in practice, what we're doing here is we are looking at the region enclosed within a contour to actually do this calculation. Now, as long as you make a decision about if you're only looking at the regions greater than a contour value or only looking at the regions less than a contour value, it shouldn't matter which of those choices you make as long as it is consistent. So this is sort of a property of contours themselves, even though we are targeting it by looking at the regions that they enclose. Just as a quick example here, we have our tiny little collection of one orange and two green circular contours, or roughly circular contours. So in this case, we're going to say that our orange contour of interest here does fall within the contour band formed by our two green contours. If we were to shift one of these around so that we had an intersection between the orange and either of our green contours, it would not fall within the contour band. Returning to being an actual ensemble setting, we have lots of different contours going on here, not just three. And so the question that we ask is, given our contour of interest, if we take two random other contours from our collection in the ensemble, what is the probability that our contour of interest is going to fall within the contour band defined by those two contours? So essentially what you end up doing is you do this process that we just did of asking if we're contained within the union and the intersection. But we do it for every pair of contours other than our contour of interest in the ensemble to sort of sample this probability. And we end up doing this where each ensemble member gets a turn, essentially, to be our orange contour. So by the end of this analysis, each ensemble member, or each contour from each ensemble member, gets a contour band depth, this probability here, associated with it, that is sort of going to give us our ranking. And intuitively, the idea here is that if we have a very high contour band depth, that we're going to have a contour that is sort of well contained by many other members of the ensemble. So we can think of it as being more central in sort of called the distribution of contours. Meanwhile, if this contour bandwidth value is very low or even zero, it means that it is either much smaller or much larger or even very differently shaped than many other contours in the ensemble, so that it's not, cleanly fitting within other sets of contours here. One thing that I want to note briefly is that, of course, all of the data sets that we work with are not going to have contours with nice, perfect circles. We do, in practice, have noise and even just lots of interesting shapes in our contour features that we're normally looking at. And so this idea of having this perfect nesting of contours to derive this estimate from is not ever really going to be super realistic. So there are a couple ways to work around that issue. The first thing is proposed in a paper that originally describes this method. And the idea is you're essentially introducing a tolerance to what you are considering as a sort of satisfactory subset. So the way that this works is we look at I'll call the area of the mismatch, or that little sliver of intersection. This is a red area here in our figure. And we're asking how much of that little bit of intersection is accounting for our entire sort of candidate subset contour. And if that ratio is sufficiently small, we effectively let it slide as far as computing contour band depth goes. This does work quite well, but one thing that we found in some offline testing with this method, and with this sort of tolerance specifically, is that it does introduce a bit of a sensitivity to the overall size of the contour features that you're looking at. Because you have that sort of area term in your denominator on the right-hand side here, even if the sort of amount of mismatch between two contours is similar across some set of experiments, if the underlying sort of candidate contour that you're looking at is very large or very small, it's going to affect the results of the analysis. In particular, something else that we found is that running things this way also makes it so that that nice property we were talking about before of being able to choose all of the regions greater than our contour value or all of the regions less than our contour value, and it not making a difference in the analysis, that falls apart because those regions now have different sizes as well. All that being said, we can make a pretty small tweak to this approach to allow it to still work in a pretty similar way with just a slightly different interpretation. So instead of this sort of relative area approach, we just look at what amounts to an area, or more specifically, a number of grid points for whatever domain you're doing this on. And we have that sort of absolute value be our tolerance instead of this ratio. This alleviates some of the issues I was just talking about, with the trade-off that you no longer have this nice dimensionless quantity to describe the sort of ratios you're looking at. And the way that you set this value of epsilon, which is a tunable parameter essentially for the analysis, requires some care in how exactly you're setting it and interpreting what that value is. For all the work that we're showing in the following slides, though, we are settling with this updated version of this tolerance, though we did find that overall the results of using either tended to yield pretty similar results. Right, so armed with all our information about contour band depth, once we've performed this analysis, we can use it to create something that looks awfully like a box and whisker plot, but for contour data. So we've essentially augmented our spaghetti plot with a few different pieces of information. First off, we are going to consider all contours with a contour band depth value of 0 as being outliers. So remember, having a low contour band depth value means that we are not well captured or not very central within the distribution. We're generally going to render those here in our dotted lines in red, or if we have a lot of contours going on, just some other contrast color. We're going to define the median contour as the contour with the highest contour band depth value. Again, this is going to suggest that it's sort of very central within the distribution. Next thing we do, we're still going to take our sort of vanilla ensemble mean and plot the contour from that for comparison. Within, that's going to generally be in green. And we have these two shaded regions that we're also going to identify. First, we're going to take all of the ensemble or all of the contours that are not flagged as outliers and shade the region that contains all of them. This is what we're going to call a 100% band, and it roughly corresponds to something like a data set with trimmed outliers. So you're no longer looking at outliers and you sort of captured the rest of your data. Finally, we are going to take the 50% of contours with the highest end-up values and call that our 50% band and shade this in our slightly darker color. And what that does is it gives us something roughly like an interportal range to start being able to interpret. So again, we've created this, what we're going to call a contour box plot, and where we start to have information like a median and an interportal range, so that if we are comparing ensembles of contours or trying to compare some other sample within the context of an ensemble of contours, we can start making some quantitative or more quantitative claims about what these things look like. All right. With all this in mind, we're going to take a minute or two to talk about a couple of synthetic ensemble experiments. So this is not real, NWP model data yet, where we've just sort of tried to engineer ways to break the method a little bit, for lack of a better way to put it. So we are trying to point out with these next couple of experiments potential shortcomings of the method that will inform the later experiments with our realistic application. Come on. Okay. So the main thing from this set of experiments that we found and wanted to point out is that the results of the contour band depth analysis, so this process of ranking all our contours with contour band depth, tends to be dominated by the largest scale at which you have significant differences between contours. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So what we have here is 3 sets of experiments, each of which occupies its own column. And in the top row, what we've done is we've sort of generated this synthetic ensemble where we have lots of different sort of wave-like perturbations at different wavelengths. Then in the bottom row, we have the same ensembles, but with everything except the highest wavelength features filtered out. And so first thing I'm going to do is draw attention to the 2 outermost experiments here. This is just by chance from this. That shading is not coming in very well. But the 2 outermost experiments. And the takeaway from these was that regardless of the presence of these smaller scale wave-like perturbations within the ensemble, the overall ranking that contour band depth assigns to all these different contours is unchanged. And so, we can see this from looking at the contour box plots. We also verified it independently looking at the numerical rankings for each of these experiments that regardless of the presence of these smaller scale features, all of the results that contour band depth give are the same results that would happen if you didn't have those there at all, and you're just looking at what's happening at the largest scales. Central experiment here, we have same overall setup, except that we have very, very little variability at the largest scales to begin with. Now, based on the contour box plots alone, it's a little bit difficult just to eyeball that we have different ensemble members getting ranked in different ways. But again, from verifying the actual rank assigned to each of these contours, we found that it was only in cases like this, where there's very little variability at the largest scales anyways, that we are able to find differences across our sort of filtered and not filtered ensembles here based on what's going on at smaller wavelengths. So now with that sort of caveat for how the method works in mind, we're going to take some time to look at experiments from some prior work of someone else in John Potterjoy's group, picking apart ensemble analyses and forecasts for a convective allowing application. It's just a quick overview of the experiments that we're going to be working with. So we're using Worth ARW with a convection allowing resolution. Everything about the statistical parameterization schemes for the two data sets is the same. The only place where these two sort of sets of forecasts and analyses are differing is the data simulation strategy that they are using. So one of these is going to be using the ensemble adjustment common filter, which for things that are relatively close to the linear Gaussian case is an approximation to the optimal filtering strategy. The other is something called the hybrid local particle filter, which in short is doing a particle filter update initially to the point that the ensemble looks more Gaussian and then sort of finishing with a more standard common filtering step. Right. So going back to our sort of motivating application of pull-to-pool information or pull-to-pools for using contours to look at pull-to-pool extent and location. What we've done here is for two different analyses. We have generated contour box plots for potential temperature anomaly for this finite linear convective system that's traveling sort of southeast over, I think that's Nebraska and a few other states there. And so main takeaway from this is that from contour box plots, we can see some pretty clear differences in sort of spatial characteristics of the uncertainty within these two ensemble prediction systems. Specifically on the sort of southwest edge of the storm here, just of the cold pool, I've added this orange line just for sort of reference, but even without it, you can see that there is a pretty clear difference between the entire location of the 100% band for the EAKF updated ensemble versus the 100% band for the hybrid local particle filter updated ensemble. So we get this sense from looking at contour box plots that there is pretty significant differences between these two ensembles and between what these two data simulation strategies are suggesting. For a quick comparison, we are going to look at the ensemble mean field for potential temperature or for anomaly from potential temperature, along with just our one contour or ensemble mean contour. It's all valid at the same time as the previous slide. And we do still, from looking at the ensemble mean field, get a sense of that same conclusion that along the sort of southwest edge of the cold pools here, we are getting sort of broader extent with the EAKF updated ensemble. But something that was sort of interesting that I wanted to note here is that this region is also somewhere where there are very shallow gradients in the potential temperature anomalies themselves. So there are a couple of points to make here. One is that the gradient in the mean field, or the gradient rather, in whatever fields you are looking at, can sort of be thought of as a conditioning almost for the contour band depth analysis, in the sense that if your if your gradients in some particular region are very shallow, then the sort of variability that you're going to get from looking at one specific contour level can vary pretty significantly compared to if you have lots of strong gradients and you're going to be right there. That being said, there's probably a bit of a user decision that goes into deciding when the features that you're most interested in are well defined by contours, if that is really the sort of target problem that you are considering, versus looking at something like a mean field. But if we are married to using something like contours and convinced that defining whatever phenomenon we're interested by the location of some contour feature, the contour band depth gives us some useful information. Right. One thing we wanted to highlight, this is the same experiment, but forecasted 90 minutes out from the previous analysis. And all we really wanted to take away from this slide and from, what we really took away from this experiment was that this idea of an outlier as an ensemble member with a contour band depth value of 0 doesn't always yield the most sort of straightforward or intuitive results. So looking, for example, at our cyan or magenta curves or contours in the EAKF updated experiment, we see that both of those quote unquote outliers, for the most part, actually tend to even fall within our 50% band for the ensemble, which, if you recall, sort of corresponds to an interquartile range. This goes back a little bit to this idea of how contour band depth behaves when you have multiple scales of uncertainty going on. But we see that there's relatively little uncertainty at the very sort of large scales. Like there are no sort of gross positional placement errors for the fold pool here. And so it's difficult to sort of suss out whether what contour band depth is picking up on here with these two flagged outliers corresponds to some actual, real signal that's corresponding to, these two ensemble members are significantly different in some way, or if it's just a little bit of noise, and if, better sampling of the, increased sampling, generating more contours from this ensemble would fix this and have those not be there. So there's a little bit of an interpretability concern for this idea of outlier detection. I'm going to pivot now to a different experiment where instead of looking at a larger convective system, we're trying to sort of get a handle on this multi-scale convection problem, so the single to multi-cell transition. And this case study is a little bit harder for contour band depth to sort of extract a whole lot of value from, because of the relatively small scales that are sort of interest here compared to the domain that we're looking at. So we're trying to get a handle on the location of all these relatively small cells within our domain, but our domain is much larger than any single one of those features. So looking at our contour box plots, the only thing that we can really sort of take away as far as significant differences between these two ensembles is that the EAKF updated ensemble tends to generate a little bit more, or have some additional small fold pool suggestions in sort of northwest section of the domain here that would not really be reflected well in the ensemble mean. We can infer that by noting that the ensemble mean contour generally, which is our green contour, is not present anywhere there in the northwest. So that's something that would be lost looking at the ensemble mean fields. Other than that, there's not too much to take away from here. Finally, one of the sort of most difficult applications for contour band depth is when you have both the case where there's a lot of spread in the ensemble and all that spread is in relatively small scale features compared to the domain you're looking at. In this case, I think I didn't note it here, but I believe almost or more than half of the ensemble members ended up getting flagged as outliers. And in that case, in some sense, the sort of contour band depth visualization almost degenerates back into a spaghetti plot. You get still some shading here that corresponds to what contour band depth thinks are sort of deeper bands, but it's difficult to really fully trust them when there's so much that is sort of being flagged as an outlier, especially that looks so similar to everything else in the ensemble. So in cases like this, contour band depth might not necessarily be providing a whole lot of value. All right, takeaways for the first part of the talk here. We've looked at this method called contour band depth that does have some nice potential associated with it, that it gives us this fully non-parametric, somewhat shape-sensitive way to describe ensemble spread for contour features. For the particular value or the particular problem of looking at mesoscale convection, though, it sometimes can give us some useful information, but there are a few concerns regarding how it sort of handles uncertainty at multiple scales that make it a little bit difficult to fully trust. That being said, we do feel that there is value in continuing to look at this method for somewhat larger problems, or things like synoptic scale modeling in a sort of regional domain where the features that you're interested in tend to be large and also specifically large within the domain that you're interested in. So I haven't given up on the method at all, but we're interested in looking at it for a couple of different other types of problems. We're going to pivot now briefly. This is going to be a slightly shorter piece of the talk. We're going to talk about some of the current work that I've been up to while I've been up here for my ASP visit. This is looking at different ways to estimate observation error variance in an online fashion during data simulation. So, very quick review of this part. I'm actually just going to start. So, what we have here is essentially describing part of the solution to a very simple data simulation problem where we have nice Gaussian error and everything is nice and linear. And what is true is that the quality of this solution of taking our background state and combining it in some way with our observation based on some weighting, the quality of that solution is determined in part by how well the errors and various components of this problem are specified. So of the two sort of main sources of error here, first is our background covariance or forecast covariance matrix, which is our E matrix here. This is generally what we target with things like post-inflation and localization strategies. It tends to be something that also is sampled better as we increase ensemble size. So there are a few different sort of existing ways to look at tuning and modifying this in terms of sort of the parameter of the assimilation process. For the purposes of this work, we are assuming that this matrix is relatively well understood. We're going to be focusing on sort of other major component of uncertainty in the problem, which is our observation error. We talk about observation error sort of generally aggregated the sense of errors in the measurement process from like instrument precision, errors in representativeness, trying to resolve things on a domain of finite resolution, things like that. So this we're going to be targeting for this work. I'm going to skip this slide actually. And so the question that we're really trying to get a handle on is if we have only our set of observations itself and the ensemble, how can we use that to back out an estimate of this Gaussian covariance matrix? Key idea for this work is that the innovation, which is the departure of our observation from the background state projected in the observation space, is this combination of information both from the observation and from the ensemble. And so we can think of it as containing information about both of those uncertainties. Again, a major sort of piece of what we need to do for trying to back out an estimate of R is assume that our estimate or our understanding of the background uncertainty is relatively clear. There's no such thing as a free lunch. We have to assume that something is reasonably well specified in order to back something else out. So we're going into this with the assumption that we have gotten a good handle on our background uncertainty. This is a figure from a paper by Girard de Rosier in 2005. Not going to go into excruciating detail on it, but essentially what we're doing here, what this figure is doing, is it is providing a geometric interpretation of the relationship between all of the sort of ensemble statistics, data simulation statistics that come out of the assimilation process. All of the lengths and angles here correspond to an inner product that's related to taking a covariance between two values. And so broadly speaking, we can think of lengths on this triangle or squares of lengths on this triangle as representing the variances in these quantities and the angles between two lines or vectors on this triangle as representing the correlation between those two. So with this picture in mind, the specific thing that we're targeting is essentially the square of the length of this side of the triangle here. So we're trying to get a handle on the variance of our observation error. We're going to sort of use this geometric picture to provide an interpretation of the two of the three methods that we're going to be doing this estimation process from. The first of these is this method described in this paper by Gerard Rosier again in 2005. And the idea is that we're going to take our analysis innovation, which is the departure of the observation from our analysis state. We're going to also take our background innovation previously described. And so geometrically, looking at our sort of triangle interpretation of this here, if we multiply our green line by our purple line, or these lengths, that can be shown to give an estimate, or not an estimate, that can be shown to equal the square of our orange line. Converting that back into sort of our statistical analog for this, what this method is doing is it is taking our analysis innovations and taking the expectation of those outer product with our background innovations, and that is giving us an estimate of our observation variance. In practice, we do this by accumulating our analysis and background innovations over the course of data assimilation cycle, and we sort of create a sample estimate of this quantity. Second method that we're going to look at also sort of uses similar ideas here. This is proposed by Alicia Karspek, who was postdoc here at NCAR in 2016. And what we're doing here is we're going to, again, take our background innovations. We're going to also look at our background error projected into observation space. And almost by the Pythagorean theorem in some sense, but again, sort of switching back and forth between the statistical and geometric interpretation of what's going on here, we get this estimate again of the observation error variance. In this case, one potential advantage of this method that we're interested in pursuing and getting a bit of a better handle on how significant it's going to be is that this is a variation that we can do fully before doing any data simulation. So there's nothing in here that's relying on analysis increments or analysis error. We can do this prior to the data simulation process and immediately have an estimate of R that we can use when we assimilate. So both of these methods have this sort of expectation-based approach to estimating R. The last sort of category of methods that we're looking at is getting a Bayesian estimate of R. So not only getting a sense of some point estimate, but also getting some description of the uncertainty or R uncertainty about this, what is effectively, again, a parameter for the assimilation process. To do this, the approach that we generally do is we model the joint density of the state and whatever our parameter of interest here. In this case, it's our R. And we break that up into two pieces. First of these is our, essentially, it's sort of a conditional density of the state given all of our knowledge about R. So for a fixed R, this is something that is generally solvable with a standarding filtering method. If you know R, you can just do sort of standard data assimilation. The other piece of that, though, is modeling this, distribution, or this, our belief about what R looks like based on all the observations we have ingested today. There are a few different strategies for resolving this term that we are sort of investigating. There are ways to sort of model it with an ensemble, or if you make smart choices about your priors for what this distribution looks like, you can continue to have something close to a nice analytical form that you can just propagate along. This is the term that, for the most part, we're focused on modeling in different ways. So we're a little short on time, so I'm going to breeze through this a little bit, but I'm happy to talk more about it later on. I'm going to just give a quick example of one way that we can do this modeling of our density for R given observations if we're only interested in a scalar variance. So this is, we're looking at a nice univariate problem or something like that. So we can, for example, if we start out modeling our belief for our uncertainty about what R is with an inverse gamma, there are a few nice advantages to this. Among them, that inverse gammas are always going to be positive definite. So there's no chance of accidentally getting estimates of the variance that are negative, which doesn't really make any intermediate sense. And so starting with an inverse gamma prior, we can, that's going to be given by our black distribution here, black dotted line. And also model the likelihood for R given a new observation based on our understanding of sort of distribution of the background innovation. So this is again going back to leveraging information within a background innovation. So we're saying, this is the statement essentially that the distribution of the background innovation is, normal, zero mean, and covariance HBH transpose plus R. But we've just written it in terms of, our observation Y here. So with this likelihood and with this prior, we get something that is not exactly inverse gamma, but that is very close to an inverse gamma as a result of this. And so, there's a question at this point of, what to do with that almost inverse gamma caveat. Some things we're considering are just doing a bit of a refitting of this almost inverse gamma to an inverse gamma so that we can then, cycle this in a nice way and keep everything in terms of this analytically described posterior. Or we can look at doing some ensemble estimate of this distribution and propagating that time. So quick set of next steps on this project. I've sort of provided just a brief overview of the three methods that I've been looking at to address this problem. So for the next month, my immediate sort of rest of my stay here up at NCAR, plan is to finish building these three methods into Dart so that we have a nice sandbox to test them with under various different issues, which comes next. So we're actually going to be exploring the performance of these methods, the different advantages and shortcomings in the face of a variety of different sort of realistic possible issues, ranging from just having some variances poorly specified initially to introducing nonlinearity and non-Gaussianity into the problem and seeing how these methods fare. And the sort of long-range vision for this work is spinning up on everything in the Gaussian case, but starting to look beyond doing estimation of the observation error distribution in more of a flexible, non-parametric, non-Gaussian way. And that's, longer time horizon at this point, but that's what this work is eventually going to be pursuing. So with that, I'm going to open for questions. Before that, I just want to give a special thanks again to John Potterjoy for making this trip possible and to everyone on the DARES team for welcoming me and mentoring me while I've been here. Thanks a ton, everyone.
Great, thanks, Henry. Whether you're in the room or online, please raise your hand if you have a question. Doesn't.
Lots to ask.
Yeah.
Since I'm his office mate. So just going back to contour band depth work.
Yep.
So you keep talking about multi-scale. Have you considered doing a scale decomposition of your features before applying your method? Because I imagine if you just do a band, what's it called, a low pass filter, your contours are not going to exhibit all those nasty, wiggly outlier behavior, right? Have you considered such an approach or tried it?
So it's not something we've tried. It is something that we are interested in trying. There are a couple of different strategies to look at this sort of multi-scale performance, concern that we're interested in. One of them is this, sort of spatial filtering strategy and trying to, even look at doing spatial filtering at a couple of different sort of bands and seeing if you can get some sort of aggregate sense of things from that. Something else we're interested in but have not yet worked out implementation details for is essentially assigning some kind of weighting strategy so that you're looking at, you can decide if you want to focus more on specific features, but that also becomes a little bit nasty in how you combine that information in a nice way. But so yes, that is something we're interested in, but it's not something we've done.
And out of curiosity, that toy example that you showed, spaghetti plots. I mean, I noticed that all of the examples you're using have this red energy spectrum in the sense if you look at the Fourier decomposition, the energy is dominant at the large scales. Have you tried doing something like a white noise kind of thing or a blue noise kind of pattern where the energy is dominated, say, at the smaller scales?
No, we have not tried that explicitly. My intuition would be that at that point you get something similar to, look at this. You get something similar to what we found in this example, and that you'd have just everything dominated by the noise and there'd be too much spread to really get anything, but it's not something we've looked at explicitly. That's just sort of my initial feeling on what that would look like. But it is something we have yet to do.
Thanks.
Okay, I'll jump in. So when Mirzarger was here visiting the DARES team, she basically did things similar to this, but it was more quantitative than what you showed today. So she basically did an analogy for a rank histogram where she had one contour that was a verification and an ensemble, and she gave a quantitative assessment of the consistency there. In your case, where you showed examples of two different ensembles, how could you make a quantitative evaluation of the differences in those things?
Something that I think I don't have an immediate answer for, but am interested in looking at more moving forward. Yeah, I think that when so I'm familiar with some of Zargar's work in, doing this more verification, like rank histogram, generalizing approach. Yeah, I guess I don't have an immediate good answer for you on how to do more of a quantitative sort of comparison analysis between two ensembles based on this information yet.
Okay. And we can talk more about this offline. I might have some ideas too. So it looks like an interesting thing. Charlie.
Just a quick maybe clarification with the in regards to the contour band, that the parameter you mentioned, the kind of the scaling parameter, which is kind of like the intersectional ratio.
Yes.
You were talking about. Is that a user specified parameter?
Yes, so that is a user specified parameter. The initial paper that described this method does suggest a couple different heuristics for how to set that parameter. The sort of one that's, I guess, say the one that we used for this series of experiments were essentially, take a step back. So if you're doing this in the univariate case, or trying to generalize this idea of contour band depth back down to the variant, you can show that the expected value over an ensemble of the contour band depth is always going to be equal to a fixed value in a variant case. And so the way that we tune this epsilon parameter is essentially trying to be as generous as we can to that. And so we're tuning this so that the expected value of the contour band depth for the ensemble, so taking all the band depth values and averaging them, gives us a particular value. And that sort of allows you to specify, if that value is high, it pushes everything in the direction of having fewer outliers. And if that value is low, it pushes everything in the direction of having many more outliers. I can try and explain that a little bit clearer another time if you're interested. But yeah, there are strategies for setting it.
Totally. Did you find that what's the, I don't know, can you comment on I guess the level of sensitivity essentially to that? Is it highly sensitive? And then do you find that those heuristics that you mentioned to be pretty useful, I guess?
Yeah, so we have in general found the heuristics to be pretty useful for the purposes of running these experiments. So every time that you run this contour band depth analysis, that would give you a different sort of value from the heuristics. So we looked at those values and we ended up fixing one for all this experiment. So we had a fair comparison. That being said, as far as sort of sensitivity of the analysis to this parameter is concerned, it does definitely have an impact in the overall, let's say this. So it will not change ultimately what sort of ordering of the contours is, but it will change what the individual probabilities are. So it will, if the value is very low, it will tend to have everything be closer to being flagged as an outlier, but that ranking or ordering of the contours will be preserved. So there's some sensitivity, but the sort of overall, findings of the method at least are preserved depending on that. choice of the value.
Okay, any last question here as we're getting close to noon?
I will fire one last question then if no one has any questions. Okay, so it's maybe not a question, it's really a comment on the Alicia Carspec approach that you've mentioned. So at Penn State, we've been doing something similar. It's called the adaptive observation error inflation scheme, but the difference is that we don't do the averaging. And in our experience, at least in my experience from studying, looking at this, that introduces a strange bias into the innovation statistics. So if you try to run, like if you do it without the averaging across observations, you might get some strange things pop up. I don't know if that's important or not, but at least there are bigger problems that mask this. So this effect may also show up in your situation. So the signature of this effect is, if you look at the innovation statistics as you cycle through the DA process, as you assimilate more and more observations, the signature would be that the O minus B on average might start to exhibit I think it was a positive bias that I saw. I can't remember, go check my old results, but I saw something like this before. So it's just a kind of a comment that kind of funky behavior might pop up.
Okay. Something to keep a lookout for. I guess I'm curious, and we can talk about this more offline, about what the exact modeling setup you're using is. Because I imagine that some of the sensitivity of, or that the Carspec method in particular, because of the fact that it's only using information from the background, might be sensitive to what the sort of evolution of the background covariances are, and sort of, based on the model dynamics a little bit. So I'd be interested to talk more about it with you.
The real issue here is much more fundamental. It's a statistical issue, is that you're doing a conditional correction of a variable that gave you that conditional probability. So it's the same thing as what we've talked about with posterior distributions. And so when Alicia averages, that disappears. If you do it observation by observation and correct by there, then you're going to be biased in the way that you interpret those values. Okay, let's thank Henry again. Thanks, Tasia. You can kill our recording.